Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're diving into something really cool, functional data analysis.
FDA for sure.
FDA, right. It's a different way of looking at data. Like imagine looking at data as like a curve or a path.
Instead of just a bunch of separate points.
Exactly. That's FDA in a nutshell.
We have a bunch of academic papers here.
Yeah, a whole stack.
Yeah.
And we're going to break them down for you. So by the end, you'll really understand what FDA is all about
Right.
and how it's used.
It's kind of like the difference between looking at a single snapshot
Oh,
and watching a whole movie.
oh, I like that.
Instead of just seeing where things are at one moment,
Right?
FDA lets us see how things change over time.
So instead of seeing like just one height measurement for a kid,
Exactly.
we'd see their whole growth like curve over time.
Yep. And that's just one example.
Okay.
Think about temperature changes over a year,
Mm-hmm.
the way your face moves when you talk,
Oh, wow.
or even how genes turn on and off in a cell.
So many different things.
All of these can be thought of as functional data.
I'm already seeing how versatile it is. But how do we actually analyze that data?
Well, each of those curves, it's like a fingerprint,
Oh, interesting.
unique to that person or phenomenon.
Okay.
In FDA, we call these functional random variables.
Functional random variable.
They show us all the possible paths the data could take.
Okay, so like each kid's growth chart
Yeah.
is a unique version of that functional random variable for growth.
Exactly. You got it.
Okay.
And FDA lets us look at not just the average trend, but also how much each individual curve varies from that average.
Oh, okay.
For example, we could look at children's growth curves and see if some kids have like faster growth spurts than others.
Oh, so we're not just looking at the whole forest, we're looking at each tree.
Yes.
Okay, that's really cool.
But sometimes our data isn't perfectly aligned.
Oh, what do you
Like, let's say we're comparing temperature curves from different weather stations. The hottest part of the day might be slightly off.
Like comparing two movies, but one starts a few minutes later?
Yes, exactly.
That would mess things up.
And that's where we use data registration or phase alignment.
Data registry.
It's about synchronizing those events so we can compare patterns accurately.
Gotcha, like lining up those movie start times. So now our curves are lined up, but how do we actually analyze these curves mathematically?
That's where things get a bit more technical. We use what are called basis functions.
Basis functions.
They're kind of like building blocks for representing functional data mathematically.
Like Legos for math.
Exactly.
So different Legos for different data.
You got it. There are different basis function systems, like Fourier series and splines.
Okay.
Fourier series are good for data that repeats in cycles, like our temperature example.
Okay.
Splines are more flexible and can capture more irregular changes.
Like that growth spurt we talked about.
Yeah.
Okay, so we're building these models of these curves using these different building blocks, but I imagine real-world data is kind of messy. How do we handle that?
That's where smoothing techniques come in.
Smoothing techniques, okay.
It's kind of like sanding down the rough edges of our Lego model to get a smoother, more accurate representation of the real pattern.
So we're getting rid of the noise and focusing on the signal.
Precisely. And one way to do that is by using roughness penalties.
Roughness penalties, okay.
This makes sure our models aren't too complicated, so they work well with new data. It's like making sure our Lego model doesn't fall apart if we bump it.
Makes sense. So we've gone from looking at curves to building mathematical models and then smoothing them out for accuracy. But how do we actually get insights from these models?
There are many powerful tools we can use. One is called Functional Principal Component Analysis, or FPCA.
FPCA. I've heard of PCA, but this sounds way more advanced.
Think of it this way. Imagine we have all those kids' growth curves. Regular PCA tells you the main ways those individual data points vary.
Right.
But FPCA looks at the bigger picture. It tells us how the curves themselves vary. It's like figuring out the common moves in a dance routine, even if everyone has their own style.
That's a great way to put it. So FPCA helps us understand those variations in the curves themselves, not just the individual points. And we can use this for any kind of functional data.
Absolutely. From weather patterns to stock prices, anywhere you see curves changing over time.
This is already amazing. Is there more?
Oh, there's a lot more. We also have functional regression models to help us understand how those curves relate to other variables.
Okay.
For example, we could look at how the daily temperature curve affects how many bikes are rented in a city.
So we're not just analyzing the curves alone, we're seeing how they interact with the real world.
Exactly. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. There's a whole world of real-world applications and even more advanced concepts in FDA.
I can't wait to learn more. Let's dive into those. Okay, so we've gotten through some of the basics of FDA.
The foundation.
Yeah, it's time to see how all of this is actually used.
Let's jump into some real-world applications.
Yes, real-world stuff.
Remember that bike rental study we talked about?
Yeah.
Researchers used FDA to figure out how weather patterns throughout the entire day affected how many bikes people rented.
So it wasn't just about looking at the average temperature for the day.
Nope. They wanted to see how the temperature changed throughout the whole day, from morning till night.
Okay.
And how those changes affected those rental patterns.
Interesting.
And they actually found that high temperatures in the afternoon, made people less likely to rent bikes.
Yeah, that makes sense. I wouldn't want a bike in the hot sun either.
Right. Who wants to be out there?
Not me. But what about the evening? Did that have a different effect?
It did, actually. Higher temperatures in the evening were linked to more rentals.
Oh, interesting.
Maybe for those, leisurely rides.
Yeah.
Yeah.
After the heat of the day had passed.
A nice, cool evening ride. Much better.
Ah.
But they didn't just look at temperature, right? What about, wind and rain?
Good point. They also looked at wind speed curves. And what they found was that strong winds, no matter the time of day, usually meant fewer rentals.
Yeah, I get that. I wouldn't want a bike in strong wind either. So this study really shows how FDA can be used to find some pretty interesting stuff. What other kinds of real-world problems are being tackled with FDA?
Oh, tons. One really exciting area is drug discovery.
Now that's something I'm really interested in. How's FDA helping us find new medications?
Well, it all starts with understanding how drugs interact with proteins in our bodies.
Okay.
You see, proteins have these little pockets on their surface. We call them binding sites.
Binding sites, okay.
That's where drugs attach themselves to work their magic.
So it's like a lock and key. The drug needs to fit perfectly into that binding site on the protein.
You got it. And FDA helps researchers analyze the shapes of these binding sites in amazing detail.
They can even see how the shape changes over time.
So by really understanding the shape of these pockets, researchers can design drugs that fit better.
Exactly. And this level of detail is so important for developing treatments that are more effective and targeted.
It sounds like FDA is giving us a whole new set of tools to fight diseases. This is incredible. But I'm curious, is FDA just for physical things? Like bike rentals and proteins? Can it be used to analyze something more abstract, like human emotions?
Believe it or not, FDA is being used to analyze emotions.
Really? How does that even work?
Researchers use it to analyze facial expressions
Okay.
from videos.
So they're turning facial expressions into curves.
Yep. They track the movement of different facial muscles over time,
Wow.
creating curves that represent the flow of expressions.
That's wild. So like an emotion decoder.
Exactly. By analyzing these curves, they can spot patterns that match different emotions.
That's so cool. It's like a secret language of emotions told through our faces.
Right. And this has huge potential for fields like psychology and human-computer interaction. Imagine systems that can understand and respond to our emotions.
That's pretty mind-blowing. Okay, so we've seen how FDA can be used to understand things like physical things, like bike rentals and drug interactions, and even things like human emotions. But we've been talking a lot about external stuff. Can FDA be used to analyze something as complex and internal as, gene expression?
Absolutely. FDA is being used to study how genes turn on and off over time.
So instead of just seeing a snapshot of what genes are doing, FDA lets us watch the whole process.
Precisely. It's like watching a movie of our genes in action,
That's incredible.
revealing the complex dance of genetic activity that controls everything from how we develop to our overall health.
It's fascinating. We've seen how FDA can be used to understand so many different things. It seems like there's no limit to what this tool can do.
And we've only just scratched the surface. There are even more advanced concepts and applications waiting to be explored.
I'm ready to dive deeper. We've seen how FDA can be used in so many ways. It's amazing. What are some of those more advanced concepts you mentioned?
Okay, buckle up. We're about to enter the world of persistent homology.
Persistent homology. That sounds intense.
It's a tool from topological data analysis.
Topological data analysis.
It's basically studying the shape of data.
The shape of data.
Imagine looking at a mountain range.
Okay.
Topological data analysis helps us see the features, like the peaks, the valleys, and how they're all connected.
I can picture that. But how does this relate to those curves we've been talking about?
Think of those curves as paths through that data landscape. Persistent homology helps us understand how that landscape changes as we move along those paths.
Okay.
Like, we could analyze a bunch of gene expression curves and see which genes change in similar ways.
So like identifying different dance routines based on the pattern of movements.
Exactly. Persistent homology helps us see past the individual data points and understand the bigger picture, the structure of the data.
Okay, I'm starting to see how powerful this could be. What other advanced concepts are there?
Well, there's the concept of depth for functional data.
Depth, so like how deep a function goes.
Not quite. Depth here means how typical a curve is compared to others. It helps us understand the data's distribution and find those outliers, the unusual curves.
Oh, so like a high-depth curve would be like the average Joe of curves,
Yeah.
and a low-depth one would be the oddball.
Exactly. Remember the bike rentals, how hotter afternoons usually meant fewer rentals. Imagine one day where rentals actually went up in the afternoon. That day's curve would likely have low depth because it's so different.
Right, like finding that one person who loves biking in the blazing heat. Depth seemed like a good tool for spotting anomalies.
It is, especially with complex data where those outliers might be hiding.
Okay, one more term caught my eye, GNOs. What are those?
GNOs, or group equivariant non-expansive operators, they're like fresh out of the oven in the math world.
New stuff, huh?
Yeah, they help us build models that kind of think like humans do, how we see patterns in data.
So like teaching a computer to see the world through human eyes.
Exactly. One area where they're showing a lot of promise is in, remember that protein pocket detection?
Yeah.
GNOs can help identify those pockets even better.
Wow, so it's like having a computer that can see those protein pockets the same way a scientist would.
Yeah, and this could have a huge impact on drug discovery.
Amazing. So it's not just about protein pockets, right?
No, GNOs could be used anywhere where human perception matters in data analysis.
This whole deep dive into functional data analysis has been incredible. We started with just looking at curves, and now we see how they can uncover patterns in everything. Bike rentals, emotions, even the building blocks of life. It's like we've learned a whole new language.
You got it. FDA is about seeing the bigger picture. It's about understanding the dynamics of the world.
And I bet our listeners are already thinking about what data in their own lives they could look at through this new lens.
Absolutely. There's so much to explore. If you're eager to learn more, I recommend checking out the R package TDA for persistent homology. And the book Functional Data Analysis with R and MATLAB is a great introduction to the field.
Awesome. Well, that's it for this deep dive. Keep exploring, keep learning. This is The Deep Dive, signing off.